Welcome back to another deep dive into the darkest corners of human nature. I'm your host, and today we're exploring 4 chilling cases that remind us how deception can lurk behind the most ordinary facades. From a beloved teacher with a sinister secret to a charming con artist whose lies turned deadly, these stories will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust. Today's episode, Shadows of Deception, examines cases where appearance and reality couldn't be further apart. We'll journey through decades of investigations, hidden motives, and the relentless pursuit of justice. So settle in, because these cases are anything but ordinary. Our first case takes us to a quiet suburban neighborhood in 1995, where a respected high school teacher named Margaret Holloway lived what appeared to be an exemplary life. She was known for her dedication to her students, her volunteer work at the local animal shelter, and her kind demeanor. But when a former student went missing under mysterious circumstances, investigators uncovered a web of lies that had been decades in the making. It was September 12, 1995, when 22-year-old Rebecca Chen failed to show up for her graduate school classes at the State University. Rebecca had been an outstanding student at Lincoln High School 7 years earlier, where Margaret Holloway had been her favorite English teacher. The two had maintained contact over the years, with Rebecca often visiting her former mentor for tea and advice. Rebecca's roommate, Jennifer Walsh, told police that Rebecca had mentioned she was going to visit Mrs. Holloway the evening before she disappeared. She'd left their apartment around 6 p.m., excited to share news about a scholarship she'd received. She never came home. When police went to question Margaret Holloway, they found her home immaculately clean, suspiciously so. The 53-year-old teacher seemed nervous, her hands trembling as she claimed Rebecca had never arrived for their planned visit. But something didn't sit right with Detective Frank Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the force who had developed an instinct for when people were hiding something. Detective Morrison obtained a warrant to search Holloway's property. What they found in her basement would shock the entire community. Behind a false wall, investigators discovered a small room containing hundreds of photographs of former students, meticulously organized in albums dating back to 1972. But these weren't innocent yearbook photos. Many showed students in vulnerable moments, captured without their knowledge. Some photos appeared to have been taken through windows. Even more disturbing were the detailed journals documenting her obsessions with specific students over the years. Rebecca Chen's name appeared frequently in the most recent journal entries. Holloway had written extensively about feeling betrayed when Rebecca had gotten engaged the previous month, expressing rage that Rebecca was abandoning her for some man who could never understand her the way I do. As investigators dug deeper into Margaret Holloway's past, a disturbing pattern emerged. Over her 23-year teaching career, at least 6 former students had filed restraining orders against her, though the school district had quietly settled these cases and moved her between schools rather than terminating her employment. The system had failed to protect students from her increasingly erratic behavior. Forensic teams discovered traces of blood in Holloway's car trunk that matched Rebecca's blood type. Luminol tests revealed that someone had attempted to clean blood from the basement floor. Phone records showed that Holloway had called Rebecca 17 times on the day of her disappearance, despite claiming they'd had no contact. After 3 days of interrogation, Margaret Holloway finally broke. She confessed that when Rebecca had come to visit that evening, she told her former teacher that she would be moving across the country after her wedding and wouldn't be able to visit anymore. Something inside Holloway snapped. She'd struck Rebecca with a fireplace poker in a fit of rage, then panicked when she realized what she'd done. Holloway led police to a remote area in the state forest, 40 miles from her home, where she'd buried Rebecca's body. The discovery brought devastating closure to Rebecca's family but opened new questions about whether there might be other victims from Holloway's past. Margaret Holloway was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and multiple counts of stalking. At trial, psychologists testified that she suffered from erotomania and obsessive attachment disorder, conditions that had gone untreated for decades. Former students came forward to testify about her inappropriate behavior and the fear they'd lived with for years. In March 1997, Holloway was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case led to significant reforms in how school districts handle complaints against teachers and mandatory psychological evaluations for educators exhibiting concerning behavior. Rebecca Chen's family established a scholarship in her name for students studying psychology, hoping that future mental health professionals might prevent tragedies like this from happening again. Our second case takes us to the picturesque coastal town of Seaside Bluffs, Oregon, where destination wedding turned into every bride's nightmare. When 34-year-old Michael Barrett disappeared on the eve of his wedding in July 2003, investigators initially suspected cold feet. But as the investigation unfolded, they discovered that the charming groom had been living multiple lives, and someone had finally decided to end them all. Sarah Mitchell had been planning her dream wedding for over a year. She'd met Michael Barrett at a medical conference in 2001, where he'd introduced himself as a pharmaceutical sales representative. He was handsome, successful, and attentive, everything she'd been looking for. After a whirlwind romance, he proposed on the beach at sunset, and Sarah began planning the wedding of her dreams. The wedding weekend started beautifully. Guests began arriving on Thursday afternoon, July 17, 2003, at the cliffside resort overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Michael seemed in high spirits, greeting guests and participating in all the planned activities. He had dinner with his groomsmen on Thursday night and spent Friday morning golfing with Sarah's father and brothers. At 2 p.m. on Friday afternoon, Michael told Sarah he was going to run some errands in town and would be back in time for the rehearsal dinner at 6. He kissed her goodbye, climbed into his rental car, and drove away. He was never seen again. When Michael failed to return by 6 p.m., Sarah called his cell phone repeatedly. It went straight to voicemail. By 8 p.m., with 50 guests waiting and no sign of the groom, Sarah's father called the police. Local law enforcement initially treated it as a missing person case, assuming the groom had gotten cold feet. But Detective Rachel Wong wasn't so sure. She interviewed the groomsmen and discovered something odd. None of them had known Michael for more than 2 years. When asked about his childhood or family, they all gave vague answers. Michael had told Sarah his parents were deceased and he was an only child, which was why there were no family members on his side at the wedding. Detective Wong ran Michael Barrett's information through various databases and hit a wall. The social security number he'd provided to Sarah didn't match his name. His driver's license appeared legitimate, but when they contacted the Oregon DMV, there was no record of it being issued. Within 48 hours, investigators made a shocking discovery. Michael Barrett was actually David Thornton, a 41-year-old con artist wanted in 3 states for fraud and identity theft. But the case took an even darker turn when Detective Wong discovered that David had been living multiple lives simultaneously. At the time of his disappearance, David Thornton was legally married to 3 different women in 3 different states: Sarah in Oregon, Jennifer in Nevada, and Patricia in Northern California. He'd been rotating between them for over 2 years, using different names and fabricated careers. He told Jennifer he was an investment banker, Patricia that he was a commercial pilot, and Sarah that he was in pharmaceutical sales. But the most disturbing discovery came when police found David's rental car abandoned in a parking lot 15 miles from the resort. There were signs of a struggle inside the vehicle, and blood evidence on the passenger seat. Someone had violently confronted David Thornton. But who? As the investigation expanded, Detective Wong found herself with 3 equally compelling suspects, the 3 wives who'd all been deceived. Financial records revealed that David had stolen money from all of them. He'd maxed out Patricia's credit cards to the tune of $90,000. He'd convinced Jennifer to invest her entire inheritance, $200,000, in a fake business venture. And he'd been slowly draining Sarah's savings account, which she'd given him access to after he claimed he needed to consolidate their finances before the wedding. But there was a 4th suspect investigators hadn't initially considered: David's real wife, a woman named Ellen Thornton who lived in Arizona and had been married to him for 15 years. Ellen had discovered her husband's double life 3 months before the wedding when she found plane tickets and hotel reservations that didn't match his supposed business trips. The case broke open when a hiker discovered human remains in a ravine 30 miles from Seaside Bluffs in November 2003. Dental records confirmed the body was David Thornton. He'd been shot twice in the chest. The murder weapon was never found. Phone records revealed that on the day of his disappearance, David had received a call from an untraceable burner phone. Security footage from the resort parking lot showed him getting into his rental car alone, but cameras on the highway captured his vehicle being followed by a dark blue sedan matching the description of a car rented by Ellen Thornton 2 days earlier. Ellen Thornton was arrested at her home in Phoenix in December 2003. In her garage, police found ammunition matching the caliber that killed David, though the gun itself was never recovered. Forensic analysis of her car revealed traces of blood matching David's DNA. At trial, prosecutors argued that Ellen had driven to Oregon after learning about the wedding, confronted David on that Friday afternoon, and killed him in a rage. Her defense team argued that she was being framed and that any of David's other victims had equal motive to kill him. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Ellen had made contradictory statements to police about her whereabouts that weekend. Her cell phone had pinged off towers near Seaside Bluffs on the day of David's disappearance, despite her claims she'd never left Arizona. In June 2005, Ellen Thornton was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 22 years in prison. She maintained her innocence throughout the trial and continues to do so from prison. The case devastated all of David Thornton's victims. Sarah Mitchell struggled with the trauma of discovering that her entire relationship had been based on lies. She eventually moved to the East Coast to start over. Jennifer and Patricia both filed civil suits against David's estate, though there were virtually no assets to recover. The case highlighted the ease with which con artists can create false identities in the digital age and led to calls for better verification systems for marriage licenses. For the three women who thought they were married to Michael Barrett, the Vanishing Groom left scars that would never fully heal. For our third case, we travel to the quiet suburb of Meadowbrook, Illinois, where the Johnson family seemed to have it all: a beautiful home, successful careers, and the respect of their entire neighborhood. 47-year-old Robert Johnson was known as the guy who would help anyone with anything. He organized block parties, coached Little League, and was always the first to offer assistance when someone needed help. But in the winter of 2011, police discovered that the perfect neighbor had been hiding a secret so dark that it would shatter the community's sense of safety forever. It started with a smell. In February 2011, residents of Oakwood Lane began complaining about a foul odor emanating from somewhere on the street. At first, people assumed it was a dead animal in someone's yard or a saw problem. But as the temperatures warmed in early March, the smell became unbearable. On March 8, 2011, city workers investigating the odor traced it to a storm drain behind Robert Johnson's property. What they found when they opened the drain would haunt them forever: human remains, partially decomposed and wrapped in plastic. Police immediately cordoned off the area and began excavating. Over the next 3 days, they discovered the remains of 3 individuals, 2 women and 1 man, all between the ages of 25 and 35. All had been dead for varying lengths of time, the most recent for approximately 6 months, the oldest for nearly 3 years. Robert Johnson was immediately brought in for questioning. At first, he seemed genuinely shocked and cooperative. He and his wife, Linda, had lived in their home for 15 years and were pillars of the community. Robert owned a successful contracting business, and Linda was a school nurse. They had 2 children in college and seemed to live a perfectly normal life. But as Detective Carl Stevens began digging into Robert's background, inconsistencies emerged. Robert's contracting business required him to travel frequently for jobs, often disappearing for days or even weeks at a time. His wife confirmed this, saying she'd grown accustomed to his absences over the years. Investigators obtained warrants to search the Johnson home and property. In a locked storage room in the basement, which Linda claimed she'd never been allowed to enter, they found a collection of disturbing items. There were driver's licenses belonging to 9 different individuals, none of whom were Robert or his family members. There were personal items, jewelry, wallets, watches, clearly taken from other people. Most chillingly, there was a detailed journal documenting encounters with various individuals over a 7-year period. The 3 bodies found near the Johnson property were eventually identified through DNA analysis and dental records. The first victim was 27-year-old Marcus Webb, a transient man who'd been living in homeless shelters in Chicago. He'd disappeared in December 2008. The second victim was 32-year-old Lisa Moreno, a sex worker from Milwaukee who'd been reported missing by her sister in July 2009. The third victim was 28-year-old Amanda Chen, a hitchhiker who'd last been seen accepting a ride in Indiana in August 2010. All 3 victims fit a specific profile. They were individuals whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive investigations. They were vulnerable, transient, and in some cases estranged from their families. Robert Johnson had carefully selected victims who wouldn't be immediately missed. As investigators reviewed Robert's journal and cross-referenced it with missing person reports across the Midwest, a horrifying pattern emerged. Robert's contracting business gave him the perfect cover to travel widely without suspicion. He would identify potential victims in cities he visited for work, people at truck stops, homeless individuals, sex workers, hitchhikers, and offer them help, money, or rides. He would gain their trust before attacking them, usually by offering to let them stay in a motel or by giving them money for food. Once he had them in a vulnerable position, he would kill them. The journal detailed at least 15 possible victims over 7 years, though only 3 bodies had been recovered. Phone records and GPS data from Robert's vehicles placed him in multiple cities on dates when people had gone missing. Investigators began working with law enforcement agencies across 5 states to connect the dots. One of the most controversial aspects of the case was Linda Johnson's potential involvement or knowledge of her husband's crimes. She maintained that she had no idea what Robert was doing and that he'd forbidden her from entering the locked basement room, claiming it contained business records and equipment. Prosecutors believed Linda must have suspected something, but they couldn't prove she had actual knowledge of the murders. She was never charged with any crime, though she faced intense public scrutiny and judgment. She divorced Robert before the trial and moved out of state with a different last name. Their children struggled to reconcile the father they thought they knew with the monster who'd been arrested. Both declined to testify at his trial and have since disappeared from public view. Robert Johnson's trial began in September 2012 and lasted 6 weeks. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The bodies found on his property, the journal detailing his crimes, the DNA evidence linking him to the victims, and testimony from forensic experts about the manner of death. The defense attempted to argue that the journal was a work of fiction and that someone else had planted the evidence on his property. But the prosecution systematically dismantled these arguments, presenting a mountain of evidence including testimony from former employees who'd noticed Robert's strange behavior during work trips. One particularly damning witness was a former business partner who testified that Robert had once joked about how easy it would be to make people disappear if you knew what you were doing. At the time, he'd thought Robert was just making dark humor, but in hindsight, the comment took on a sinister meaning. In November 2012, Robert Johnson was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was also charged with multiple counts of kidnapping and abuse of a corpse. The jury deliberated for only 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. During sentencing, families of the victims gave emotional impact statements. Marcus Webb's mother broke down while describing how she'd never given up hope of finding her son, even when others had told her to accept that he was probably dead. Lisa Moreno's sister spoke about the shame society places on sex workers and how Lisa had been trying to get out of that life when she was killed. Amanda Chen's father described the agony of not knowing what happened to his daughter for over a year. Robert Johnson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion as the sentence was read and declined to make a statement. The case of Robert Johnson left investigators with haunting questions that may never be answered. His journal referenced many encounters that didn't match known missing persons cases. Are there more victims out there whose disappearances were never reported? Are there more bodies waiting to be discovered? The Meadowbrook community was traumatized by the revelation that a monster had been living among them for years. The story of the perfect neighbor who turned out to be anything but continues to serve as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facade. Our final case takes us into the world of family dysfunction, greed, and murder. In the affluent town of Willow Creek, Connecticut, the Ashford family was known for their wealth, their philanthropy, and their beautiful estate. But when 78-year-old patriarch Harrison Ashford died suddenly in October 2016, his death set off a chain of events that would reveal just how far some people will go for money. This is the story of the inheritance killer. Harrison Ashford had built his fortune through a successful chain of manufacturing plants across the Northeast. By the time of his death, his estate was valued at approximately $42 million. He'd been widowed for 10 years and had 3 children: Charlotte, age 52, a successful attorney; Brandon, age 48, who'd worked in his father's business; and Victoria, age 43, a socialite who'd never held a steady job. The family dynamics had always been complicated. Charlotte was the overachiever who'd never quite gotten the approval she craved from her father. Brandon had worked hard to prove himself worthy of eventually taking over the business. And Victoria had been the baby of the family, spoiled and indulged, though Harrison had grown frustrated with her irresponsible lifestyle in recent years. Harrison Ashford died on October 14, 2016, at his estate. The cause of death was initially ruled as a heart attack. He'd been having health problems for several months, so his death, while sudden, wasn't entirely unexpected. The funeral was held 3 days later, attended by hundreds of family members, business associates, and friends. The reading of the will took place 1 week after the funeral. This was when things got interesting. Harrison had made significant changes to his will just 6 weeks before his death. Under the new will, the estate was to be divided equally among his 3 children, with one major caveat: Victoria would receive her inheritance in a trust, with controlled distributions over 20 years. She wouldn't have access to the lump sum. Harrison's attorney explained that the patriarch had made this decision because Victoria had a history of financial irresponsibility and addiction issues. He wanted to ensure she would be taken care of without having the means to harm herself. Victoria was furious. She stormed out of the attorney's office, screaming that her siblings had poisoned their father against her. Charlotte and Brandon tried to calm her, but she refused to speak to them. 3 weeks after Harrison's funeral, on November 7, 2016, Brandon Ashford died in what appeared to be a tragic accident. He'd been driving home from dinner with friends when his car went off a winding country road and crashed into a tree. He was killed instantly. Police investigated and found that Brandon's brake lines had been severed. This was no accident. It was murder. Suddenly, investigators were looking at both deaths with fresh eyes. If Brandon had been murdered, could Harrison's death have been murder too? Detectives obtained a court order to exhume Harrison Ashford's body. A new autopsy revealed something the first had missed: traces of digoxin in his system at levels that were potentially lethal. Digoxin is a heart medication that can be deadly in high doses, and it can mimic the symptoms of a heart attack. Harrison had been prescribed digoxin for his heart condition, but the levels in his system were far higher than his prescribed dosage. Someone had been giving him extra doses, deliberately inducing a fatal heart attack. Detective Margaret Riley was assigned to lead the investigation into both deaths. She began by examining who had the most to gain from the murders. With Harrison dead, his estate was divided among his 3 children. With Brandon dead, his third of the inheritance would be divided between Charlotte and Victoria. But there was another wrinkle. Brandon had recently updated his own will, leaving everything to his partner of 5 years, a man named Thomas Rivera. Brandon and Thomas had been planning to get married the following spring. If Brandon died before the wedding, Thomas would inherit his share of the Ashford estate, over $14 million. Detective Riley now had multiple suspects with financial motives. She began the painstaking process of examining everyone's movements, financial records, and relationships with the victims. Investigators discovered that Victoria Ashford had severe financial problems. She was over $3 million in debt, mostly from gambling and to support a cocaine addiction she'd hidden from her family. She'd been counting on her inheritance to solve all her problems, and the trust arrangement meant she'd only receive controlled payments, not enough to cover her debts. Financial records showed Victoria had recently searched online for information about digoxin overdoses and brake line sabotage. Her cell phone records placed her near Brandon's house the day before his car crash. But Charlotte and Thomas Rivera also had motives and opportunities. Charlotte had access to her father's medications as she'd been helping manage his healthcare. Thomas would benefit enormously from Brandon's death, though colleagues and friends insisted he truly loved Brandon and was devastated by his loss. The case broke wide open on December 2, 2016, when Charlotte Ashford was rushed to the hospital after collapsing at her office. Toxicology tests revealed she'd been poisoned with antifreeze, which had been added to her coffee. She survived, but barely. This third attack narrowed the suspect pool considerably. Charlotte couldn't have poisoned herself, and Thomas Rivera had been out of state at a business conference when Charlotte was poisoned. That left Victoria as the primary suspect. Police obtained a warrant to search Victoria's apartment. In her bathroom, they found a bottle of digoxin pills matching the brand Harrison had been prescribed. In her garage, they found tools consistent with those needed to cut brake lines. Most damning, they found a half-empty container of antifreeze in her kitchen, despite the fact that she didn't own a car. Victoria was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. She maintained her innocence, claiming she was being framed by Charlotte, who wanted the entire inheritance for herself. Victoria Ashford's trial began in September 2017 and was a media sensation. The prosecution laid out a methodical case showing how Victoria had systematically killed family members to increase her share of the estate. They presented evidence of her financial desperation, her internet searches, her access to the means of murder, and her presence near the crime scenes. The defense argued that Charlotte had orchestrated everything, including poisoning herself to throw suspicion away from herself and onto Victoria. They claimed Charlotte had been the one with true access to their father's medications and could have easily framed her sister. But the jury found the evidence against Victoria compelling. Her financial motive was clear, and the physical evidence found in her possession was damning. Character witnesses testified about Victoria's history of lying, manipulation, and blaming others for her problems. In November 2017, Victoria Ashford was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole for each murder count, plus an additional 20 years for the attempted murder of Charlotte. As the verdict was read, Victoria showed no emotion. Charlotte, sitting in the gallery, wept quietly. Thomas Rivera, who'd attended every day of the trial, left without comment. The Ashford estate was eventually settled. Charlotte inherited everything, as Brandon's share passed to Thomas, who then negotiated a settlement with Charlotte. Thomas established a foundation in Brandon's name to support LGBTQ+ youth, donating most of his inheritance to the cause. Charlotte struggled with survivor's guilt and the knowledge that her sister had tried to kill her. She sold the family estate and moved across the country, trying to escape the memories. She rarely speaks publicly about the case. Victoria continues to maintain her innocence from prison. She's filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. The inheritance she killed for will never be hers. The case of the inheritance killer serves as a stark reminder that family bonds can be destroyed by greed, and that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we should fear most. These 4 cases remind us that danger doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears a friendly smile, teaches your children, stands beside you at the altar, or sits across from you at family dinners. Margaret Holloway seemed like a dedicated teacher. David Thornton seemed like the perfect partner. Robert Johnson seemed like the ideal neighbor. And Victoria Ashford was family. The common thread through all these cases is the mask of normalcy that these killers wore. They moved through society, their dark impulses hidden beneath carefully constructed facades. And in each case, it took tragedy to reveal the truth that had been lurking just beneath the surface all along. As we close this episode, remember that vigilance isn't about paranoia. It's about awareness. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Pay attention to inconsistencies in people's stories. And never assume that evil can't exist in your community, in your family, or in your life. Thank you for joining me for this deep dive into the shadows of deception. If you found this episode compelling, please like, subscribe, and share it with fellow true crime enthusiasts. Leave a comment letting me know which case affected you most and what you'd like to hear about in future episodes. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the truth is often stranger and darker than fiction.